All right, we're here with Dr. Brad Wilcox. Would you mind telling us just a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'm Brad Wilcox, and I teach here in the David O. McKay School of Education at BYU. And I started kind of being fascinated as the fantasy genre took hold in schools and everyone was reading Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings. I was fascinated as I watched children start to write fiction. And then I watched them go through this process of trying to invent names.
Okay.
And I started seeing that as they would try to invent names, they would do little things, where maybe they'd pattern after a name that was in the other book, but change it just a little, or maybe, they'd name one character Abalon, and then the next character would be Babylon, and the next narrative Cabalon and Dabalon. I mean, all the names started sounding similar. And as I would work with them with their writing, it started making me wonder. I thought, we have a lot of unique names in the Book of Mormon.
Right.
Not names that are known in the Bible, like Noah or Samuel. I mean, those are names that are recognizable. But there are a lot of unique names as well.
Absolutely.
Names like Abinadi,
yes.
Names like Aminadab, or Antipas,
right.
or there's Haggoth.
Right.
So these are names that if Joseph Smith wrote the Book of Mormon, then he would have had to make up a lot of names. 100 and some odd names.
Wow.
And I thought that in and of itself would be a task,
Right.
And then I thought if he really were writing the book, inventing it as so many people say, rather than translating the book, I thought, I wonder if there were patterns in those names. And so I started me thinking about fictional patterns and then patterns in names that are not from fictional sources.
Okay.
So I teamed up with Wendy Baker, who's from the linguistics department,
cool.
and also Dennis Eggett, who's from statistics, and Bruce Brown, who's from psychology, but has also done a lot of work with census names and the history of names, and has worked extensively with the American Name Society. So we started brainstorming together and started saying, let's take a look at the names that come from the Lord of the Rings, which are definitely fiction.
Right.
We know the author. And let's take a look at the names from the 19th century U.S. Census that would have been names that Joseph Smith would have been familiar with.
Yeah.
And let's take a look at these names that were real names that had come from other languages.
Right.
And then let's take a look at the names of the Book of Mormon and see how they compare. Not just how they compare in overall, length,
right.
but also how they compare in the placement of the sounds.
Right.
The phonemes, and what they call biphones, which is the pairs of sounds. So we used a phonotactic calculator that's available online, and we actually broke all these names down into into the sounds. And so instead of just using the spelling that appears in the Book of Mormon, then we translated that into the sounds.
Wow.
And then put all that into this calculator.
Oh my gosh.
And we were able to start seeing that generally between the three groups there wasn't a lot of difference.
Right.
The 19th century names were quite a bit shorter than the names from the Lord of the Rings and Book of Mormon. But other than that, there wasn't much of a difference as far as comparing them to English. But when we broke it down into the sounds, the level of the sounds, the order of the sounds, what's the probability of this sound coming at the beginning of a word in English? What's the probability of this sound coming third in a word in English?
Okay.
And what's the probability of these two sounds coming together in English? Boy, when we started looking at it at that level, then we started seeing some really statistically significant interactions.
Wow.
Here you can see on the chart that the yellow is the Lord of the Rings names. And even though Tolkien, even though we know Tolkien made them up very consciously,
Right.
based on other languages and even based on invented languages.
Right.
He wasn't just making these up haphazardly. But even though he did it very consciously, the names still follow a very even pattern phonotactically.
Okay.
Whereas the Book of Mormon names are very different from the Lord of the Rings names and actually mirror, as you can see in some of the charts, they mirror the authentic names. So the Book of Mormon names actually have more in common with real names
Wow.
that have come from other languages than they do with fictional names.
Wow.
So as I say here at the end of this little part here on the chart, the fact that the names in the Book of Mormon have more in common with authentic names derived from other languages than fictional ones is of interest to those who view the work as a translation into English rather than a work of fiction written in English.
Fascinating.
I mean, bottom line,
Wow.
I just have to say, if Joseph Smith made up all those names, he certainly did it in a way that was cleverer than Tolkien. And he would have to be pretty bright to create names in a way that was beyond
Authentic.
even what Tolkien did.
Yes.
So
Wow.
I would, everything that I've been studying has told me that the books aren't, the names in the Book of Mormon aren't made up. Rather, they are authentic names. And it'll be interesting to continue this study. We want to look at other works of fiction, even works of fiction that would have been from the same century as Joseph Smith, like Gulliver's Travels and some others. We want to continue to look at other languages. If the Book of Mormon names, are not necessarily English-like, then can we see phonotactically that they have links to Hebrew or Egyptian? As scholars have studied the names, they can show that this is Aramaic or that this is, but phonotactically, in the sounds themselves, can we find enough of a corpus or a base in Hebrew that we could make some comparisons there? I'd love to compare the Jaredite names to the Nephite names and see what differences exist phonotactically between those two groups of names in the Book of Mormon.
Right.
And I'd even love to take a look at the Bible itself and compare some of the Book of Mormon names to the unique names of the Bible. So, I don't know. There's still a lot to do.
Yeah.
We're just barely starting and barely scratching the surface.
Right.
But it's been a fascinating research study. We presented it at the American Name Society, where it was, interestingly, very well received.
Wow. Who would have guessed?
Yeah, very well received. And they were fascinated by this kind of in-depth look at these names. We also have plans to try to get this written up so that it can be published. And I'd also like to take a look at authors, contemporary authors today, interview them, and find out what do they think about when they're naming a character.
Right.
What's on their minds as they create names, and then
What's
be
their
able
process?
to look at Joseph Smith's life and say, do we see those same themes surfacing in the Book of Mormon, or again, is it very different?
Right.
So this is looking at it statistically, but I'd also like to look at it kind of in more of a qualitative way.
Right.
And it's just been a really interesting journey.
Well, congratulations and good luck as you continue forward with that. I hope that you'll try and submit it to BYU Studies, and we'll see something about it in the journal soon.
Well, that is what I'm keeping my fingers crossed for. That's our
Good.
goal.
All right. Well, thanks so much for your time,
Hey,
Dr. Wilcox.
thank you.